Let me begin with this: history does not move quietly. It roars, it shakes the ground beneath us, and every once in a while, it delivers a moment that tells us the balance of power in our world is changing. And tonight, we are staring directly at one of those moments. The headline reads, Egypt deploys Chinese Doomsday missiles to counter Israel. Facts show Egypt is ready for open war. That, my friends, is not just news. That is a seismic shift. Egypt's historic military pivot, marked by the deployment of Chinese Doomsday missiles, is not simply an arms deal. It is a profound geopolitical statement. For decades, Egypt has balanced itself between Western support and regional autonomy, relying heavily on U.S. military aid, weapons, and training since the Camp David Accords. That arrangement, while lucrative in terms of resources for Cairo, has come with strings attached: political restrictions, surveillance, and the constant reminder that Egypt's arsenal was shaped by American approval. What we see now with the acceptance and deployment of Chinese missile systems is not merely an upgrade in Egypt's military capabilities. It is Egypt's way of signaling to the world that it no longer wishes to be contained within the old framework of American dominance. This pivot is bold, unprecedented, and filled with historical resonance. The hook is this: when a nation breaks free from the hands that once armed and restrained it, the world must take notice. Imagine the weight of that decision. Egypt is not a minor player in global politics. It is the most populous Arab nation, a cultural and historical anchor in the Middle East, and a country with a long record of confrontation and negotiation with Israel. By bringing Chinese Doomsday missiles onto its soil, Cairo is essentially redrawing the lines of power in the region. These weapons are not defensive in the narrow sense. They are strategic, designed to alter the balance of fear, to make adversaries think twice, to inject a new uncertainty into the calculations of war. The mere presence of these weapons transforms Egypt from a recipient of Western charity into a self-asserting actor capable of dictating terms. That is the hook the world must grasp. Egypt is no longer playing by Washington's script, but by its own, and by Beijing's. Let's ask why this matters so profoundly. For decades, U.S. military aid was Egypt's lifeline. Billions of dollars flowed annually to secure a compliant ally, to keep the peace treaty with Israel intact, and to maintain Washington's influence over Cairo's choices. That relationship created a dependency, one that Washington assumed would last indefinitely. But Egypt's pivot to Chinese missiles is the declaration of independence from that dependency. It is Cairo saying, we will not be forever indebted. We will not remain trapped within a system where Washington gives with one hand and controls with the other. It is a rupture with a long-standing tradition of reliance, and the hook is unmistakable. When a country breaks with its benefactor, it changes the game for everyone watching. Consider the broader symbolic weight. These missiles are Chinese, not American. That fact alone tells us that the global order is tilting. China has not just exported electronics, infrastructure, and investment. It is now exporting deterrence, exporting the tools of sovereignty, exporting the means to resist Western dominance. Egypt's choice to buy, deploy, and publicize these missiles signals to other nations that alternatives to American arms exist, and that such alternatives carry political value as well as military power. The hook here is sharper still. When one Arab state chooses China over the United States, others may follow, and the architecture of U.S. dominance begins to crumble piece by piece. Now look at this through the eyes of Israel. For decades, Israeli leaders operated with confidence that Egypt would never cross certain lines, that American aid kept Cairo restrained. But with Chinese Doomsday missiles deployed, Israel cannot assume its southern neighbor is harmless. Deterrence is back on the table, and deterrence cuts both ways. For Israel, this is not just a threat, it is a reminder that military superiority is fragile. For Egypt, it is leverage in negotiations, leverage in conflicts, leverage in asserting itself as a true regional power. The hook, my friends, is this: a single decision to align with Beijing has shattered decades of assumptions and has left Israel facing a new, uncertain frontier. What is unfolding is bigger than missiles, bigger than Egypt, bigger than Israel. It is about the very structure of world power. The American monopoly on Middle Eastern security has cracked. China is stepping into spaces where Washington once ruled uncontested. Egypt's pivot is the case study that makes this visible, undeniable, and historic. And here's the real hook, the one we cannot ignore: when nations that were once dependent colonies of U.S. power start arming themselves with the weapons of America's greatest rival, that is no longer a regional adjustment. That is the beginning of a new world order. For decades, Israel has enjoyed what it considered a sacred advantage: overwhelming military superiority over its neighbors. From the Six-Day War to the present, Israel has operated under the assumption that its advanced air force, cutting-edge missile defense systems, and U.S.-backed technological edge gave it a permanent upper hand. This superiority was not only military but psychological, a deterrent embedded into the minds of Arab leaders who recognized the futility of direct confrontation. But with Egypt's deployment of Chinese Doomsday missiles, that long-standing assumption is collapsing. Israel must now face a sobering reality: that its supposed invincibility is no longer guaranteed. The hook is direct and chilling. For the first time in generations, Israel is staring at the possibility of being matched, challenged, and even deterred by a neighbor it thought restrained. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Israel's military dominance was never just about defense, it was about shaping the politics of the region. It allowed Tel Aviv to act with confidence, to take risks in Gaza, in Lebanon, and in Syria, knowing that no neighboring state could impose real costs on it. That confidence, bordering on arrogance at times, was underwritten by the assumption that Egypt, despite its population and history, was kept in check by its reliance on U.S. aid and Western oversight. But Chinese missiles on Egyptian soil changed the game entirely. They introduce uncertainty into Israel's calculus, uncertainty that makes preemptive strikes riskier, retaliation more dangerous, and regional escalation a real possibility. The hook is that uncertainty itself. It is the shadow that now hangs over every Israeli military plan. Let us not underestimate the psychological dimension here. Israel's military is not only about hardware, it is about reputation. The Iron Dome, the precision airstrikes, the rapid mobilization, all of these are meant to project an image of invulnerability. That image has been one of Israel's greatest weapons, dissuading enemies before conflicts even begin. But Egypt's deployment signals to the region that invulnerability is a myth. If a neighbor can acquire missiles capable of striking deep and hard, then Israel is suddenly human, suddenly vulnerable, suddenly forced to consider the limits of its power. The hook is devastating. When invincibility is exposed as illusion, deterrence itself begins to crumble. Now consider the political fallout. Within Israel, the government thrives on the promise of security, that no matter the threat, the military can neutralize it. The appearance of Chinese missiles in Egypt forces Israeli leaders into a corner. Do they escalate in response, or do they accept the erosion of their dominance? Neither choice is comfortable. Escalation risks direct confrontation with Egypt and possibly with China's backing, while acceptance risks undermining public confidence at home and emboldening resistance movements across the region. The hook is brutal in its simplicity. Israel is no longer in total control of the narrative, and control of the narrative has always been its strongest shield. The regional implications are equally profound. If Egypt can openly challenge Israel with Chinese support, what message does that send to other actors? To Iran, it suggests that Israel's superiority can be pierced. To Saudi Arabia, it suggests that new alliances are possible. To Hamas and Hezbollah, it suggests that Israeli dominance is no longer absolute. In other words, Israel's aura of supremacy is fading, and with it comes the possibility of emboldened adversaries on multiple fronts. The hook here is contagious. The perception of weakness spreads faster than weakness itself, and Israel may soon find itself fighting not one enemy but many, each sensing that the tide is turning, and behind it all stands China. Beijing's role is not simply that of an arms dealer, it is that of a power broker reshaping the very equations of conflict. By equipping Egypt with these missiles, China has punctured Israel's monopoly of fear. It has shown that U.S. backing is not the only pathway to strength, and it has left Israel long accustomed to dictating terms, in the awkward position of responding to someone else's initiative. The hook is startling. Israel, for the first time in modern memory, is being forced into reaction, not action. This is not just about military technology, it is about psychology, politics, and global strategy converging in one explosive moment. Israel must now live with a reality it has not faced in half a century, the reality of a credible military equal at its border. And that reality does not just shift balance sheets or defense budgets, it shifts the very psychology of power in the Middle East. The hook is final and undeniable. When superiority is challenged, dominance unravels, and with that unraveling, the world changes course. China's expanding footprint in the Middle East is no longer an abstract idea confined to trade routes or investment portfolios. It is now etched into the missile silos and launch pads of Egypt. For years, Beijing has been quietly weaving a web of influence through its Belt and Road Initiative, securing ports, infrastructure projects, and energy deals across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. But when Chinese Doomsday missiles arrive in Egypt, the story shifts from economics to geopolitics, from building roads to reshaping battlefields. This is not simply about Egypt acquiring weapons, it is about China demonstrating that it can rival and in some cases replace the United States as the supplier, the partner, and the guarantor of power. The hook here is sharp. When Beijing's missiles face off against Washington's allies, we are no longer talking about competition, we are talking about confrontation by proxy. Consider the symbolic importance of this shift. For decades, Washington armed Egypt as part of a grand bargain peace with Israel in exchange for billions in aid and weapons. That aid was meant not only to stabilize the region, but also to ensure that no rival power could gain influence in Cairo. China's entry into this equation breaks that bargain wide open. Egypt's decision to accept Chinese weaponry is not a transaction. It is a declaration that American leverage has limits, that U.S. dominance is no longer unchallenged. And with each missile transferred, China sends a message far beyond Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, to Iran, to Turkey, to the entire region. The message is that Beijing is no longer a distant observer, it is a central actor. The hook is this: once a single state crosses the line and embraces China militarily, the door swings open for others to follow. The reach of China's influence extends beyond the weapons themselves. Missiles are not just hardware, they come with training, maintenance, strategic advice, and the quiet presence of Chinese experts on the ground. Every Chinese system deployed in Egypt tightens a web of dependency, ensuring that Cairo must look to Beijing not just for supplies but for guidance. This is how empires are built, not merely through conquest but through entanglement. The hook is unnerving. The deeper Egypt ties itself to Chinese weapons, the harder it becomes to disentangle from Beijing's orbit, locking Cairo into a new geopolitical gravity. What does this mean for Washington? For decades, the United States positioned itself as the indispensable power in the Middle East, the one partner nations could not afford to lose. But now China has carved out space in the one area the U.S. considered untouchable: high stakes, high technology military supply. That alone is a challenge to American hegemony. And the fact that Egypt, a cornerstone of U.S. strategy in the region, is the one making this pivot makes the challenge even sharper. The hook is stark. If Washington cannot keep Egypt in its orbit, then its grip on the rest of the region begins to look fragile, even reversible. For Israel, this Chinese expansion is doubly unsettling. Not only must it confront new weapons on its border, but it must also recognize that those weapons are backed by a global superpower. It is one thing for Israel to deter Egypt, it is another to calculate the risks of angering China. That calculation changes every move Israel makes, every decision it takes, every confrontation it considers. The hook is clear. The presence of Chinese weapons in Egypt means Israel is no longer facing Egypt alone. It is facing the shadow of Beijing, a shadow too vast to ignore. Let us not forget the broader regional ripple effects. China's involvement signals to other states that the global order is shifting. Iran, long sanctioned and isolated by the West, sees validation in its own reliance on Chinese and Russian partnerships. Gulf states, hedging their bets, begin to imagine futures where Chinese technology secures their borders as effectively as American contracts once did. The perception grows that Washington is not the only game in town, that multipolarity is not a theory, but a reality unfolding before our eyes. The hook is powerful. Once states believe they have alternatives, loyalty to American leadership becomes negotiable, and the entire architecture of U.S. dominance begins to wobble. This, then, is what makes China's role so profound. It is not just about weapons or economics or diplomacy. It is about rewriting the very rules of power in the Middle East. Egypt's deployment of Chinese missiles is the clearest signal yet that Beijing has crossed the threshold from competitor to co-architect of the regional order. And when that threshold is crossed, history tells us the consequences ripple far beyond the battlefield. The hook, my friends, is unmistakable. China is no longer rising. It has arrived, and its arrival is changing the Middle East forever. Egypt's readiness for open conflict is no longer speculation whispered among diplomats. It is being demonstrated in military drills, in intelligence assessments, and in the fiery rhetoric emerging from Cairo's leadership. For years, Egypt's armed forces were characterized as defensive, cautious, and oriented around internal stability rather than external confrontation. But that characterization no longer fits. The acquisition and deployment of Chinese Doomsday missiles is not an act of defense alone, it is preparation. It signals to Israel and to the wider world that Egypt is not only willing to defend itself, but also prepared to take the fight to its adversary if circumstances demand it. The hook here is plain but unsettling. Egypt is not bluffing, and readiness itself is often the clearest sign that war is no longer unthinkable. When a nation declares its readiness, it is not only about stockpiling weapons, it is about signaling resolve. Egypt has spent the last decade modernizing its military, purchasing advanced aircraft, submarines, and now missiles that can shift the balance of power. Each of these moves builds a layered capability that extends far beyond mere deterrence. War games conducted by the Egyptian military showcase scenarios that explicitly anticipate confrontations with external adversaries, scenarios where missiles are not just defensive shields but offensive tools. The hook is stark. Egypt is rehearsing, training, and openly preparing for what was once dismissed as impossible, a direct clash with Israel. The political climate inside Egypt reinforces this readiness. Cairo's leadership understands the mounting anger of its people at Israel's actions in Gaza and beyond. The Palestinian cause resonates deeply in Egyptian society, and the government knows it cannot appear weak or indifferent. By aligning with China and showcasing new military capabilities, the Egyptian leadership taps into a wave of nationalist pride and regional solidarity. This is not only about hardware, it is about legitimacy. Leaders who demonstrate readiness for open war, even if they do not initiate it, gain political strength at home and credibility abroad. The hook lies in that political reality. Sometimes a nation prepares for war not because it seeks destruction, but because readiness itself becomes a form of survival in the political arena. What makes Egypt's readiness particularly significant is the context of shifting alliances. When Cairo drills its military with Chinese weapons systems, it is not only preparing for battle, it is rehearsing alongside the technology and doctrine of a new global partner. That readiness now carries the weight of Beijing's influence, ensuring that every missile launched, every tactic employed, is part of a broader geopolitical statement. Egypt is positioning itself as a frontline state in the emerging multipolar world order. The hook is profound. Readiness here is not just national, it is global, carrying implications that extend far beyond the Sinai Desert or the Gaza border. For Israel, the perception of Egyptian readiness is a strategic nightmare. Deterrence is a delicate game, and Israel has long relied on the assumption that its neighbors were unprepared or incapable of sustaining direct confrontation. But the sight of Egyptian drills, the confirmation of missile deployments, and the rhetoric of Cairo's officials all combine to send a message that cannot be ignored. Israel must now calculate not only whether Egypt can retaliate, but whether Egypt might strike first under the right conditions. The hook is sharp. When one side believes the other is ready for open war, the line between deterrence and preemption becomes dangerously thin. International observers cannot afford to treat this as empty posturing. History reminds us that wars often ignite not because leaders want them, but because readiness creates momentum, momentum creates miscalculation, and miscalculation triggers escalation. Egypt's posture today mirrors precisely that dangerous pattern. The military is armed, the public is mobilized emotionally, the alliances are shifting, and the weapons are in place. The hook is sobering. Readiness has a gravity of its own, pulling nations toward conflict even when neither side explicitly seeks it. Egypt's readiness, then, is a reality that reshapes the conversation about the Middle East. It is no longer enough to describe Cairo as a cautious actor or as a passive recipient of Western aid. It is a nation that has chosen to arm, to train, and to align itself in a way that makes conflict not only possible but potentially imminent. The hook that emerges is unavoidable. When a nation of Egypt's size and history prepares for war, the world must listen, because readiness is often the loudest warning before the storm. American power under pressure, those four words define the moment we are now witnessing in the Middle East. For decades, the United States positioned itself not simply as a global superpower, but as the indispensable power in the region. Washington controlled the flow of military aid, determined the scope of alliances, and ensured that Israel's security would remain beyond challenge. Egypt, in particular, was kept close through billions of dollars in annual assistance, a deal designed to tie Cairo's hands while guaranteeing peace with Israel. But with Egypt's pivot to Chinese Doomsday missiles, the illusion of unshakable American influence is unraveling. The hook is piercing. When even a cornerstone ally chooses to arm itself outside Washington's orbit, the myth of American indispensability begins to collapse. The foundation of U.S. dominance rested on two pillars: money and weapons. Aid packages secured loyalty, while American-made fighter jets, tanks, and defense systems created dependencies that made alternatives seem impossible. Egypt's acceptance of Chinese missiles punctures both pillars. It signals that financial aid no longer buys obedience and that military dependency can be broken when alternatives emerge. For Washington, this is a nightmare scenario. The hook here is unavoidable. Once one nation proves that U.S. aid is not a leash, but a crutch that can be discarded, others will see the path to independence. The pressure on American power is not just about Egypt. It is about perception across the region. Washington has always wielded influence through fear of losing aid, fear of sanctions, fear of isolation. But when Egypt openly courts Beijing and equips itself with weapons beyond U.S. control, that fear weakens. Other states, from Saudi Arabia to Turkey, watch closely and begin to ask the same question: if Egypt can defy Washington and survive, why can't we? The hook is dangerous for U.S. policymakers. Influence is contagious when strong, but so is defiance. Washington now faces a dilemma. To reassert dominance, it could attempt to punish Egypt through aid cuts or political pressure. But doing so risks driving Cairo further into China's arms, accelerating the very shift Washington fears. Alternatively, the U.S. could look the other way, pretending its grip remains firm. Yet this denial only emboldens others to test the limits of American patience. The hook lies in this bind. Whichever path Washington takes, it loses. Punishment reveals weakness, silence exposes irrelevance. Israel, long accustomed to American backing, also feels the tremors of this pressure. The promise of U.S. protection has been a constant reassurance for Israeli leaders who relied on Washington to deter any major threats. But Egypt's missile deployment suggests that U.S. guarantees are no longer ironclad. If America cannot prevent its allies from turning to Beijing, can it truly prevent them from challenging Israel directly? That question destabilizes not only Israel's security but its very confidence in the American shield. The hook is chilling. Once doubt enters the mind of an ally, reassurance becomes nearly impossible to restore. The broader international stage magnifies this decline. China's rise as an arms supplier in the Middle East mirrors its rise as an economic partner. The more Beijing expands, the smaller Washington appears. Each Chinese port built, each missile sold, each alliance secured erodes the perception of U.S. supremacy. American power is not vanishing in one blow. it is eroding steadily, chipped away by choices like Egypt's. The hook is historical empires rarely collapse overnight. They erode through 1,000 small fractures until one day the structure gives way. What makes this moment especially damaging for Washington is the symbolism of Egypt itself. This is not a small Gulf state experimenting with alternatives. This is Egypt, the cultural, demographic, and military giant of the Arab world. Its decisions carry weight far beyond its borders. When Egypt pivots, others take notice, and the precedent it sets becomes a roadmap. The hook is plain. Losing Egypt is not just losing an ally, it is losing the linchpin of U.S. strategy in the Arab world. American power under pressure is more than a headline, it is the reality of a shifting global order. The United States still wields immense influence, but for the first time in decades, its allies are openly testing the boundaries of that power. Egypt's deployment of Chinese missiles is both a symptom and a catalyst of this pressure. The hook that resonates here is profound when the strongest player on the board begins to lose control of its own pieces. The game itself is nearing transformation. The risk of escalation in the Middle East has always lingered just beneath the surface, but Egypt's deployment of Chinese Doomsday missiles elevates that risk to a level not seen in decades. These weapons are not meant for symbolic parades. They are strategic tools designed to alter calculations and deter adversaries. Yet deterrence is fragile, and history teaches us that the presence of powerful weapons often invites miscalculation rather than stability. The situation unfolding today is a textbook case of how a single shift in military posture can ripple outward, destabilizing not only two nations but an entire region. The hook is stark when both sides arm themselves to the teeth. The line between defense and aggression blurs, and the smallest spark can ignite a firestorm. Israel now finds itself in a dilemma it has not faced since its early wars of survival. For decades, its overwhelming superiority allowed it to act with confidence, assured that no neighbor could truly threaten its existence. But Egypt's new arsenal introduces uncertainty into every decision. If Israeli leaders believe Egypt's missiles pose an existential risk, the temptation for preemption grows. A preemptive strike, however, would almost certainly trigger a direct Egyptian response, escalating into open war. This is the peril of deterrence. The very weapons meant to prevent conflict can, under the wrong circumstances, make conflict more likely. The hook is chilling. Israel's fear of what Egypt might do could be the very reason war breaks out. Cairo's calculations are no less fraught. While Egypt has acquired these weapons to bolster its security and elevate its regional standing, possession alone creates pressure to prove resolve. No government can parade advanced missile systems without also showing the willingness to use them if provoked. Egyptian leaders know their public, galvanized by anger over Palestinian suffering and frustrated with decades of humiliation, will not tolerate endless restraint. This political reality ties Cairo's hands. Deploying Chinese missiles raises expectations that they will be used if Israel crosses certain red lines. The hook is dangerous. When weapons are tied to national pride and public pressure, restraint becomes harder to sustain. The danger does not stop at Israel and Egypt. A conflict between these two nations would almost inevitably spill over. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and potentially Iran could see opportunity in Israel's distraction and vulnerability. Gulf states torn between their relationships with Washington, Beijing, and Cairo could be forced into choices they would rather avoid. The Middle East, already a patchwork of fragile ceasefires and simmering conflicts, could become a battlefield with multiple fronts. The hook here is global. What begins as a regional clash risks spiraling into a confrontation involving multiple actors, each escalating in response to the other until the conflict no longer resembles the spark that began it, and hovering in the background are the great powers. The United States cannot ignore a war that threatens Israel, its most important ally in the region. Yet Washington's leverage is already weakened by Egypt's pivot to China. Direct U.S. intervention would risk drawing Beijing into the conflict, whether diplomatically or even militarily, through increased arms shipments and intelligence support. In this way, the Middle East becomes not just a regional hotspot, but a stage for global rivalry between America and China. The hook is sobering. A war in Gaza or Sinai could evolve into the opening confrontation of a new Cold War, fought not with ideology but with missiles, alliances, and proxy battles. History is filled with examples of how great wars begin with small sparks. An assassination in Sarajevo, a skirmish along a border, a miscalculation in a tense standoff. Egypt's deployment of Chinese missiles creates precisely the kind of tense standoff where accidents can no longer be dismissed as local. One misfired rocket, one misinterpreted drill, one hasty retaliation could unleash a chain reaction no one can stop. The hook and the warning is undeniable. When the tools of war are this powerful and the politics this volatile, escalation is not a question of if, but of when. The Middle East stands now at the edge of a precipice. Egypt's readiness and Israel's anxiety form a combustible mix, while external powers circle the region with their own interests at stake. The world should not underestimate how quickly events can move from tense standoffs to open conflict. The hook that must echo in our minds is this: the deployment of these missiles is not just a military development, it is the trigger of a new and dangerous era, where escalation is no longer a distant fear but a looming possibility. So I leave you with this closing thought. We are entering an era where American dominance is no longer the only game in town. Nations like Egypt are finding strength in new partnerships, and the consequences of those choices could reshape our century. Will this lead to a more balanced world, or to a catastrophic confrontation? That, my friends, is the defining question. And if we are not ready to face it, history will not wait for us. Thank you.